jump right. All right, so thank you for coming to our Growing Garlic in Winter Crops course. My name is Jackson Hambrick. I'm the Community Education Manager for Gateway Greening. So just a little bit about Gateway Greening, because I know we have some people that just aren't maybe as familiar, maybe just found this just kind of randomly on the web. Our mission is to educate and empower people to strengthen communities through gardening and urban agriculture. We do this through a variety of ways. We have over 200 and I think 50 now, this hasn't been updated as recently, over 250 projects around the St. Louis region. This little map in the top right is probably also not fully up to date since it only says 200 there. But St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and then kind of the I-55, the 255 loop within Illinois as well. So there's quite a few more Illinois projects that aren't on that map. And so we provide community, school, and just general gardens that are for the community. We provide in-kind stuff of beds, materials, tools, soil amendments, things like that. If you're ever interested in joining a community garden or finding one in your neighborhood or near you, you can always reach out to us or go to our map on our website. If you're interested in starting one or starting a school garden, you can always reach out. We have information on our website about that. And then school program, we do have some volunteering as well. So if you're ever interested in just maybe doing some individual volunteering, or if you are at an organization, whether at work or in school, that does kind of large group volunteers, we send out over 250 groups a year, usually around 10,000 hours or so are done at sites throughout St. Louis at our gardens. So it's a great way to kind of build some camaraderie, do some great work in your community, and just get outside, which is always something we need to be doing. And then just before we kind of jump in, I know I'm kind of doing, this is actually going to be the last class that we do as Gateway Greening. We are going to be changing our name next week. I cannot say what we're changing it to, but keep a lookout. If you don't follow us on social media right now, you can still follow us through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, things like that. And it's Gateway Greening. But next week, I think on Wednesday, we will be making our announcement of our name change. And while we're doing this also, we are going to be moving our office to the Delmar Divine, which is off of Delmar and DeBoliver in the old St. Luke's Hospital. So we're not down on Washington near Jefferson. So if you try to go to that site, we're not there. This is where we will be. All this information will be on our website. If you try to go to gatewaygreening.org after Wednesday, it will redirect you to the new name. So it's not like you need to memorize some new name, but just something is to kind of keep the ideas out there. So, but anyways, so what we're all here for tonight, we're going to be talking about garlic and some extending of fall crops. So kind of what we're going to do, just because of how I think about these, we'll kind of first start with just a little bit about fall crops. Kind of how to extend them, because this is the time of the year that we should be thinking about that. If you do have some of those plants in the ground, talking about a little bit about planting timing, which doesn't really work for right now because there isn't much you can plant of cool season crops outside of these winter crops. But it is a question we often get whenever we're just talking about season extension techniques. So I always like to just kind of throw that in there, and we'll talk a little of that. Then I'll just talk about different season extension techniques that we find to work pretty well in St. Louis and Missouri, and just kind of the pros and cons, or just things to think about when you're implementing those. And then we'll jump into kind of the heart of the class, where we're talking about garlic, shallots, winter onions, things like that. So first, fall crops, season extension. I really love this diagram. If you've seen some of my other classes, I think it's just a really nice example of the range of where our sunsets are, and how sun is such a major factor in why we need to be thinking when we're placing our gardens, when we're doing our planting for a lot of our crops, that southern sun and eastern sun are some of what we really need, because sun is usually, definitely when we're getting into the fall and winter, is our limiting factor for growth, much more than temperature. So as you can see, middle of the summer, we're getting sun exposure kind of all over, for like this example of this house, the north side, the west side, the east side. obviously the south side, but then as we get later into the year, so as we're kind of looking right around now, we're starting to get a lot lower sunsets, sun's going down right now, which we're at 6 o'clock, and we're going to get less and less. So whenever we're doing kind of our season extension, if we have a choice of where we can be planting these season extending crops, trying to get as much southern sun exposure is something to be doing. So outside of sun exposure, obviously frost is usually what people think about for extending our season, and these techniques of season extension are all about controlling temperature. So frost is very important to think about. So for here in St. Louis, we're zone 6, pretty much our first frost date. It's starting to come up. October 20th is right around then. And as the temperature was a lot cooler today. And as we obviously get later into the fall, into the winter, it'll be getting colder every day. But what this means for our first frost is usually our cool season plantings for the spring, March, whatever. We're not worried about that right now. But it's July and August for a lot of stuff. And so that's where I was kind of making that point earlier of there isn't really like planting collards or kale or chard or some of these plants that do really well once we go extending that season. You really can't plant those now to have them grow into the winter and get some nice winter harvests out of them, just because they need to be planted so much earlier because they need so much more sunlight. We'll talk a little about that. But before we kind of dive into a little bit more about temperature and season extension, there are some other things to just think about. It's not just our ambient temperature that we see on our weather app. There are a lot of other things to think about, thinking about the ground warmth. So closer to the ground, plants that are closer to the ground, they're more frost tolerant. The ground is basically a heat sink. It's holding in some of that temperature. So if you have just thinking about kind of heights of plants as well, because air movement more wind will cool off the plants faster. So if you have some, maybe like if you're growing kale, usually if we're doing like an extension of kale into the winter, we often keep our kale that we plant in the spring all like in the ground through the summer, which then it looks kind of ugly, but then it looks really nice once we start getting into this weather for the fall. Pretty often we don't extend that plant into the winter. We're usually planting in the fall for another extension. You could do that, but we've been harvesting throughout the year, the height of that kale plant is just so much higher. It's literally physically taller than the ones that we plant in the fall. And so it has less frost tolerance just because of its height, and it's more reactive to the air and things like that. It's also harder to physically like keep within a season extension technique, and like the row covers or the cold frames just because of its height. Humidity is something also just to be thinking about. It's really one of our benefits of Missouri. It's very humid here. Our humid air holds heat better, which during the summer isn't great, but is nicer right around now and into the winter. And it also can kind of reduce that drying of that air, of that kind of heavy air moving. And then kind of just a term, microclimates, thrown around a lot, but basically kind of our thought of season extension is we're creating an artificial microclimate that we're trying to produce just a little bit warmer space to keep our plants around. So like I mentioned, we were talking earlier about sun, and sunlight and sun exposure is really the most important factor for kind of getting our season extension and planting and getting things kind of large enough into the winter. This is probably the most important factor. And this is why we have to plant so early in the fall. So pretty much after November 18th, we don't get much growth from most of the plants that we eat. There's not enough sunlight in the day, and the plants basically just are kind of going into just a state of just kind of staying around, surviving, but they're not producing. The leaves aren't getting much bigger. If they are getting bigger at all, they're not producing any more leaves or anything like that. And so what that means is, I thought I had a next slide. Usually by November 18th or so, you want to shoot for about 75% to 100% kind of full size growth of the plant. So if we're growing a chard plant and we're like, I really want to make sure I want to eat these leaves kind of through the winter. want that plant's basically days to maturity from planting. So kind of counting back from November 18th. I want it to be kind of at its full size by then. So we count back and plant on that day. What that means, so if we're kind of looking at our planting calendar of when to plant things, it means, like we were saying on that slide much earlier, it means we're planting a lot of this stuff in July and August. And if you take in our fall class on kind of gardening in the fall, we talk quite a bit about tips and techniques to try to keep your cool season plants cool when we're planting in August, because it'll be 100 degrees outside. It's real challenging. These plants don't like it, so you might not get a lot of consistent germination. If you do, you might just have a lot of pest problems and things like that. The plants just aren't in a great environment for them. So using shading, keeping them cool often, mulching, things like that. These are things that can really help them along. But we plant them right around here, and then they basically get to kind of their full growth by the time we hit November. You can push these back maybe a couple weeks, or you can just really just try and see what happens if you miss this planting window. Because at worst, you just get a kind of a small plant that it might not grow much through the winter, but you still got one, which is great. And so what kind of plants to grow, kind of pulled these ones off of it, is these are kind of the main cool season crops you see people planting. And I think I have some recommendations, about what to plant. And one thing is we will be sending the slides out. This is also recorded. So kind of looking at this kind of information, it's a little bit easier, I find, when you're kind of on your own looking at it. Planting calendar is also available on our website. I think it's on the main page. If you scroll down, you can click it and download it from there. But like I was saying, so 75% growth, November 18th, kind of what we're shooting for. Those kind of longer growing plants, the collards, the kale, carrots. So let's take a look. So, right there. Our collards, kale, chard, mid-August or so, early to mid-August is when we really want to be planting. Carrots take a long time, so July, you could probably get away with being into August as well. Beets take a little bit less time, so you can go a little bit later into August. Kind of one of the latest plants you can plant and still get some good growth out of is spinach. It's one of those plants that also doesn't need as much sunlight as others. It can handle and grow decently well in low light conditions or in some shade. So you can see we have you can be planting almost all the way to the end of September. And also spinach, kind of overwintering spinach, is pretty much any overwintering of plants. They're going to get sweeter just because as the plant, it's getting colder out, the plant is pumping in more sugars to prevent the plant from freezing. And spinach in particular is really tasty when it's overwintered. And so kind of what varieties that seem to do well for winter harvest. First, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some ones that I like to grow and we found have done pretty well. But first, if you're looking at them and maybe it's not on this list, doesn't mean it doesn't do great over the winter. Take a look at those seed packets, see what kind of winter hardiness it says. But often, like for the kales, most kale plants can do pretty well, but then there's some ones that do real well, like the red Russian, the dino kales are pretty great, and the Siberian kale. I found pretty much all types of arugula do great over the winter. It's also one of those that grow pretty quick, similar to kind of spinach, where you can get small leaves are still really useful in cooking and eating. Also, that cold temperature really makes the arugula a lot more mild. So the spiciness isn't as strong, it adds a little bit more richness and sweetness to it. So if you're thinking about trying out maybe next year or doing maybe an early planting in the spring of something, arugula is a great plant to try out. Chard, these two are just really good varieties. Most chard can handle pretty well. These spinach are just ones that we've grown. I find the biggest challenge with growing spinach is germinating the spinach consistently. Once it's germinated, if the weather is cool, so you're planting in the fall, it usually does great, but the germination seems to be a little inconsistent. These carrots, and there are tons of overwintered carrot varieties, so you can use these or you can take a look at some others. These radishes are also kind of similar, more overwintering, but really a lot of them can handle it. And then turnips, and then for lettuces, I really like the Salanova ones that go over the winter. They have shorter leaves, so they're a little bit closer to the ground. They just have less exposure to kind of wind and frost damage. And so they seem to do really great. They also have some funny, they're pretty frost tolerant, and they also have some heat tolerance as well. They're a pretty unique lettuce in that. And so kind of with our extensions, so we've picked our plant, we planted our kale plant maybe in August. We did a really great job. It's nice and big. And we're like, all right, we're going to be extending this. And we really want to have some kale through the winter. So first thing, pretty much any plant that we're extending through the winter, we're going to be, it doesn't matter what type of extension technique we're going to be putting over the top. We're always going to be mulching the soil. So late fall, so probably in a couple weeks, you could probably start putting some mulch on the ground. You could do it now, just kind of a little bit early. Start just paying attention to when we start seeing some of those freezes. 32 degrees, not the end of the world, but once we start dropping into like the mid to high 20s, mulch should be, you should start be thinking about putting mulch on your beds. 2 to 6 inches. And this is one of those where when we talk about mulching during the growing season, we always talk about kind of leaving some space around the plant. This time during the fall and the winter, you can kind of ignore that. So we don't really want to leave any space around the main part of the plant. We want that mulch right up next to the plant because we're providing insulation. Now we don't want to be putting mulch on top of the leaves and stuff like that, but right next to the plant. It always will give a couple more degrees of protection. If you're really extending this stuff to where you're going to be having you're going to be basically, you're wanting to eat some of this stuff maybe in like February or March. You might need to be adding a second layer, probably in maybe mid-January or so, depending on what type of mulch you used. If you use like a straw mulch, maybe you might not need to, or even a wood mulch, just because they don't break down that fast. You might just need to, just if they've like physically like sunken a little bit. But if you're using a leaf mulch or if you're using compost as a mulch, you'll definitely need to be adding a second layer in the winter. They just start to break down faster. And so adding another 2 to 6 inches, basically trying to get it back to that original height that you mulched at the beginning. And so you've mulched your plant. And so now you're kind of like, all right, basically the two kind of main options is you can do a low tunnel technique. So using a PVC or using some metal rings to basically just hold a fabric or a plastic sheeting over the top of the plant. So this will protect, depending on what they are. So if it's a row cover, so it's like this guy right here, it will let air flow through it, but it's kind of more of like a blanket. So it's a fabric, it'll keep some insulation in, you can water through it really well. So if you do need to be doing some watering, which through the winter, we're not doing much watering at all, but sometimes if the soil gets really dry, it gets kind of warm out, it's something to think about. It also does let warm and cool air kind of move through it. So the wind kind of comes through. So if we get some pretty hot days in the winter, you don't have to worry with row cover about going out and taking row cover off of any plants. While if you do use a plastic sheeting, like in this image right here, I think this kind of looks like a plastic sheeting as well. That plastic won't let air through unless sometimes you'll see some that have like some cutout holes in them, or maybe it's like a perforated one with little holes in it that will let some air in. But if it doesn't, and it's just like a plastic sheet, then if it gets kind of warm out, just kind of pay attention. You might need to just kind of open up a side, maybe not the whole thing, but just to kind of let some air flow through. It'll also prevent kind of with that kind of jumping of temperatures, because it's going to be cold out. And in Missouri, we can get some pretty nice warm days in the middle of December. It could get really hot underneath that plastic. So then we get, you get some moisture buildup. You could actually start getting some mold. You could also be kind of putting a lot of stress on these plants because they're jumping from cold temperature to hot temperature. So just kind of opening it up, let some air flow through, get kind of that stagnant air out is one thing. But that's only if you don't have a plastic that doesn't have any holes or just things like that. And then The reason you would kind of pick a plastic, so if you're like, well, should I just pick the row cover over a plastic? So the plastic, it will let in, it'll have more sunlight come in, it'll trap that light and heat in. So it does a better job at basically keeping it warmer at colder temperatures over a row cover. And it's one of those things where our winters were like right on the edge of where some winters, if we have a pretty mild one, a heavy row cover could just be fine and you could make it through and you'd be okay. If we get a really cold winter, get down to maybe like pretty consistent, like 10 degrees, you want to be putting some plastic on top. And I've seen people do, and often we've been practicing, trying out the technique a little bit more of doing kind of a fabric row cover like this, and then putting a plastic right on top. So we get kind of that double protection, which is nice. And then if it gets really warm out, we just take the plastic, because the plastic's over the row cup, the fabric. We just take the plastic off, and so we can kind of let it breathe, but we still have some nice insulation. So just some techniques to think about. Those metal rings, you can either just kind of stab, or the PVC, you can stab into the ground. Some people put these brackets on the sides of, if they're doing a raised bed. We've seen people do these ones. This one's nice because it actually has a vent right there, but they're using these kind of cow panels to kind of almost create a rigid structure of it. So kind of a low cost way to almost make kind of almost into a high tunnel, almost from a low tunnel, which is nice. So, and then there's cold frames. So you've kind of like, oh, maybe I'm going to do a cold frame. And cold frames, they're one of those things for extending the season is a little bit, you have to get kind of creative, or only certain plants can really work. So with like a row cover, you got a pretty good amount of space. If the plants are kind of decently tall, you can fit them underneath there. Cold frames are often usually only like 2 2x4s on top of each other, maybe a little bit more. So we're looking at like 6 to 8 inches of height in certain areas. So a lot of people use cold frames often to start the plants in the spring because they're much smaller. You can kind of get a jump on it. But if you are using it for the fall for season extension, you might have to either be putting something on top of it. So I think like, here's a nice picture in the bottom right of some like straw, which just, I mean, this isn't exactly a cold frame, but it's using the same mechanism. Or you might just have to physically just make your cold frame bigger by putting some more boards underneath. The one thing with cold frames, they're going to provide much more protection than low tunnels, the plastic or the fabric. If it is just like a slightly warm day, so like with the plastic, if we get up to like 50 degrees, you're probably okay. If we get up to like 50 to 60 degrees with a cold frame, you're definitely going to need to be opening it up and vent it out because it will get way too hot in there. They do need to be south facing because they have this kind of nice angle to them. So we're trying to get as much sunlight in as possible. So they need to be facing south or wherever in your space you get the most amount of sun exposure during the winter. Hopefully it's south, but maybe it's like southeast or just kind of a different angle. And you pretty much, with all of these, you're really not watering much during the coldest months. And definitely with cold frames, I find like that temperature change really, there's quite a bit of moisture in the cold frames. And then just like with those row covers and low tunnels, you're adding in some mulch around for the plants. So this image right here, we have some small plants that have been started, it looks like, but if you notice like this kale plant, it's probably a little too big for these cold frames. So just something of what you're planting is something to think about. So, all right, so that's kind of our season extension. And now we're going to kind of jump into our garlic and talk a little bit about some winter crops. If you do have questions through it, type in the Q&A. That'll be really helpful. I can't unmute anybody, so there's no way I can hear what you have to say if you can't figure out the Q&A. But we can also, I have my email at the end, so if you have questions, you can always just shoot me an email. So, all right, so winter crops. So first, I mean, like why to grow them. So if you do ever work in like schools or interact, they're great for schools because most of the school year is when we're not growing a ton of things. So garlic, these winter crops are really great because you plant it when the kids are in session Now you don't do much of the harvest, but there is kind of that maintenance of the space while students are there. They're pretty much all these are super easy to grow. And it's nice just to have some green in the garden over the winter. So in between the snow and just kind of the brown, it's nice to have a little bit of something. And so kind of what are the crops that we're going to be talking about today? We're going to talk about garlic, we'll talk about shallots. We're going to talk a little bit about walking onions. Now there's quite a few other winter crops, but these are the ones most people think about. And with our limited time, this is kind of what we need to be covering. But if you are interested and you're like, oh, I already know about these, kind of on your own, maybe do a little bit of some Googling of some other perennial alliums. So kind of following into those shallots and things, those walking onions. There's some other types of onions, some other types of leeks. And then there are always a huge collection of winter grains. While probably growing at home, you can't get much grain out of it. It is still kind of a fun educational exercise just to kind of do it. Also, again, adding some nice plant material, just kind of green in the garden over the winter, which is great. So just always want to make a point of that. You can always do some Googling on your own. So talking about garlic. So whenever people are talking about garlic, we usually break garlic down into three types. So we have our hardneck, we have our softneck, and then we have our elephant garlic, which technically is a leek, but we treat it and grow it like a garlic. So we're pretty much considering it a garlic plant. So kind of the softneck and hardneck. So there is hardneck garlic, which is a really nice cross section. And the things to think about of the differences between hardneck and softneck is our hardneck garlic produces a scape. So that's this guy right here in late spring. It's an edible part. It's basically a flower that it's putting out that you can break off and eat. Hardneck produces a single ring of larger cloves versus if you look at this image right here, our softneck garlic, which produces multiple rings of cloves. The flavor of hardneck garlic is a lot more intense than softneck garlic, and the cloves are a lot larger, as you can kind of see with this. Softneck garlic, this is often the garlic that we find in the grocery store. If you're just kind of buying garlic, cloves are smaller, closer to that size. They produce 2, sometimes 3 concentric rings. So you see, we got a third guy kind of growing out here. If you're kind of a weird shapes. And the flavor often is milder than hardneck. And here in St. Louis, we can grow either one. I have not really found much of a difference between softneck and hardneck in like what we're growing and how it does. Now, between varieties of these types of plants, that's kind of where we've seen yield differences and rot differences and things like that. But between just hardneck and softneck, we haven't seen a huge difference between the quality of them. And then there's elephant garlic. So like I mentioned, it's actually a leek. It produces a much larger bulb. Usually you only get about 4 cloves per head of elephant garlic. And it also has the mildest flavor. So like while the cloves are really big, you only get a few out of it. Usually I find I really like garlic that I'm using 1 to 2 of those cloves per basically one of like a hardneck garlic. So I feel like sometimes I need using a little bit more elephant garlic, which is fine depending on how you're cooking. Maybe you want just more garlic in a dish. Elephant garlic is nice. It also often sends up a flower stalk, kind of like a scape. It is not really edible compared to a hardneck garlic scape. And sometimes they'll be purple, sometimes they'll be white. You can cut them off, you can leave them. I don't think there's been much research of showing any difference in yield amounts, but they're just kind of nice to have. So with all 3 of these, we follow the same types of planting techniques and just kind of what we do. So first, pretty much all this garlic, they're heavy feeders, so they pull a lot of nutrients out of the soil. So we want to make sure the soil that we're planting in has quite a bit of nutrients in it. So if we have had something planted in throughout the year, so maybe we had some tomatoes or some other heavy feeders, maybe potatoes or sweet potatoes, we want to be adding some compost or a fertilizer to the soil before we plant our garlic. Pretty much the month of October is when you should be planting. And then 2 to 3 inches deep in the ground, kind of doing this, kind of what here, is usually the technique most people do. They take a hoe or a shovel or something and just make kind of a nice deep trench. You plant them 2 to 3 inches apart with the butt kind of down, I like to think of, or the bottom of the garlic with the kind of thin part at the top pointing up. You want them about 4 to 6 inches apart. You don't really want to go much closer because the closer you get, they start crowding each other. They might, if you plant too close, you might not actually get some fully formed cloves when it's time to harvest. And then you do about 1 foot between the rows. And so then after planting, you can plant and then you can wait a little bit, but once we start getting into the winter, you want to make sure you mulch your garlic. So you can use a straw mulch like this picture right here, lots and lots of mulch. This is actually kind of mulched into the spring, I think, so this isn't right after because they're a lot larger, but doing a straw mulch, you can do a leaf mulch as well, or wood or compost. It doesn't really matter, just something to kind of insulate the ground. The one thing is the benefit with a leaf and a compost is you're going to be adding nutrients to the soil, which when we get to the spring, so over the winter, the garlic really doesn't need to be watered much. You might, if we get like some weird, like really warm spell and it's really dry, you might want to go out, just stick your finger in the ground. If it's like no moisture, it feels really dry, maybe just water them then. But they really don't need much. And then once we start getting to the growing season, really pay attention because you don't want to overwater, because the one thing, while these are very easy plants to grow, too much moisture can cause the garlic to rot, and root rot is usually the #1 issue when people have issues with garlic. So just paying attention. Really, we don't do much watering. I find our springs are kind of, we get enough rain to where it's usually fine. But usually around March and April, you want to be adding in a few more inches of a compost or fertilizer or something to the bed. So if you had mulched with a straw or a wood mulch, what that means is you're gonna have to pull that straw or wood mulch kind of off or to the side, put that compost or whatever you're using to fertilize the soil, and then kind of put that straw and leaf mulch back over the top. Because if you put the compost on top, you're not really getting the compost breaking down into the soil. Also, you might actually start speeding up the breakdown of your straw and wood mulch, which can pull nutrients out of the soil and kind of almost defeat the purpose of you composting and putting fertilizer onto your bed. So, but around March and April, this is, I think, a picture early March. So the garlic's about this size. You can go a little bit, you can wait a little bit longer if you want. But just kind of in spring, you want to be adding a little bit more compost to it. And then right around kind of late spring, they've kind of shot up. Your hardneck garlic will be producing a scape right here. So it'll be shooting up. I don't know if we have another picture. We don't. And it's basically this kind of flower stalk that'll start to curl. Usually once it's curled once, that's usually when I start to think about taking them off. You can wait a little bit longer. Just the thing is, the longer you wait, they do eventually start to kind of harden. And while these are edible, you do have to kind of cook them. Usually I treat them kind of like a green bean or something like that. They're very tasty. They have a strong garlic flavor to them. But if you wait too long, they start to get really woody, and technically, I guess they're still edible at that point, but they're not that tasty. And you don't have to take the scape off, but if you do in the hardneck garlic, usually you'll increase the size of your garlic bulb at the end of the year about 25 to 35%, because the plant's not putting any energy into the flower above it. It's then diverting all of its energy into the bulbs below. So, and usually the best technique is just kind of take some scissors right where it comes out. You can cut it. In this picture, I think we broke it off, because if you've done it enough, you can kind of get the breaking, but try and start out with some scissors or some pruners first. And then, so once you've kind of done that, it keeps growing for a little bit longer. And then usually around late June to mid-July, and this is kind of the biggest kind of maybe of when, because it really depends on how warm our spring is and really when that garlic kind of gets started to really start growing. So if we had a really warm spring and started early, it might be closer into June. If it's kind of, we had some cold, it was kind of cold, we didn't get much growth in the spring, it might be closer to mid-July. But the best way to tell is when the bottom 2 to 3 leaves have turned brown. So this picture right here is a very great picture of that. So we got 2, 3 leaves on them, but the tops are still green. So we don't want to harvest. If you just let it sit there, it would go all brown. We don't want to wait that long, because if we wait that long, the cloves inside the garlic bulb will be separating. And so as they separate, they'll start to let in dirt, moisture, or things like that between each other. And so they'll start rotting a lot faster. So if you wait too long, they could even be rotting in the ground. But even if you get it before that, but they've already separated, it's really hard to dry them out good enough for them to be able to store a long time. Now, you could eat it right away and you'd be fine, but most of us are growing our garlic to kind of store and eat throughout the rest of the year. So the bottom 2 to 3 leaves, it's something I always just have to remind myself, because onions, when you're growing, is like a different policy of just kind of when they're all browning and tipping over. Well, you don't want to wait that long with garlic. And so when you're harvesting, make sure to dig up carefully. If you're kind of wondering and you're like, well, 2 to 3 leaves, it still looks really green, just dig up one, cut off the top of just basically treat that one as one you're going to eat right away. Cut it, open it up. If it has fully formed cloves in that head, it's ready to go with the 2 to 3 leaves. If it doesn't, yeah, you probably need to leave it in a little bit longer. So once you've harvested them, if you do plan on storing them and not just eating all your garlic right away, you'll need to cure them. So the best technique really is kind of a hang drying or laying out kind of dry. Ideally, we'd have in like a nice 80-degree space that's sheltered with some nice airflow. Now we're harvesting these in mid-July, June to July. If you're leaving them outside, which our pictures right here, we always leave them outside. It's never 80 degrees then. So while that's the ideal, it's perfectly fine to have them outside curing when it's 100 degrees, tons of humidity. It just means they'll take a little bit longer. So I think usually when you hear, like, if you read online, they'll be like, 2 to 3 weeks it'll take. Usually I find it's closer to 3 to 4, maybe 5 weeks, depending on how it is. And kind of the best way to tell is, first, they've gone completely brown. So they're nice and green when you harvest, they go fully brown. And then when you do bring them down and you cut basically the garlic from the rest of the stalk, it's just fully dry. There's just no moisture. It doesn't feel like anything's there. That means it's ready to go. And then from there, just treating it like regular garlic, store it in a cool, dry place. And you should be pretty much at the same level of buying garlic from the store. It'll last that long. And then the best way from there is find the biggest bulbs that you had, so the whole bulb, and just save that for planting next year. You can always go buy new garlic, but if you want to really like kind of curate and get like the biggest and best garlic harvest from your garlic, this is the best way, is just kind of saving those biggest ones, plant those next year, and then the following year you pick the biggest of those, and you're kind of almost doing your breeding of your own garlic to make the biggest bulbs you've got. So that's garlic. And so then for shallots, they kind of follow the same thing. And shallots they're basically like a red onion type of bulb, kind of a cross between a garlic and an onion. But you treat them very similar to garlic. So we plant at the exact same time. They also are pretty heavy feeders. We do about 6 inches apart, rows about 12 inches, 2 to 4 inches deep. You again also do the same technique of mulching with straw, wood, leaf, compost, whatever you got. And then you do a little bit of watering if you need to over the winter, but really pay attention. While garlic also has root rot, shallots is like even more finicky of it. So really paying attention, just sticking your finger in the ground. If you feel any kind of moisture at all, they don't need it. But having some really rich soil also helps just kind of prevent that rotting as well. And so then for harvesting, you harvest roughly around the same time as garlic, though I've found whenever I've done it at the same time, it's not always in sync. So something to pay attention to. So when the leaves start drying up, and the tops are starting to fall over, kind of this picture right here in the bottom right, they're ready to go. But you really, again, just like garlic, you don't want to wait until all the leaves are brown, because if you've done that, it's pretty much like they're probably rotten. Maybe not all of them, but you probably have a significant amount in there because they've been there for too long. Just like with garlic, and I don't know if it was mentioned, about 2 to 3 weeks before you're going to harvest, it's just a good idea to really stop watering of them, or really cut back your watering in general. If it's like really hot out, maybe they do need a little bit, but just to help you with that kind of harvesting and the moisture exposure, it really helps with your curing as well. For curing, they're a little bit tougher to hang than garlic, just because they're not as sturdy of stalks. So usually we'll like lay them out and just make sure they're kind of turned every week or so, just so that like they're not putting all their weight on one side of it. I have seen some people hang them pretty well. You just have to be a little bit more careful because the stalks can kind of break when you're doing it. And then, yeah, 2 weeks to 4 weeks, maybe a little longer. And then just like with that garlic, save those biggest bulbs to replant next year, and just kind of keep doing that. And it's great. So that's shallots. And so then the last little one we're going to talk about before we jump into some questions, I'll kind of quickly go through it, is walking onions. They're also known as like Egyptian onions, tree onions, top setting onions. They're a really interesting hybrid between kind of a bunching onion and a shallot. And when you kind of see them, you're like, oh yeah, it like looks just like an exact hybrid and mix of them. And so what they do, they produce, so they are kind of like a shallot underneath in the ground. They have a nice green stalk right there, kind of similar to a green onion. And then they do top setting. So that's why they have one of the names of them as a top setting onion. They set at the top of that at certain times of the year, little onion bulbs that then you can plant. It has a very strong flavor. They are perennials, and often you find with perennial, just alliums and perennial plants in general, they have a little bit more pungent, stronger flavor than their annual cousins. But that means they are a lot easier to grow. They have an interesting timing, and depending on when you're dealing with them depends on what parts you're going to eat. So at the beginning of the year, in February or so, they produce this kind of green stalk. So if you can tell in this picture, there's snow on the ground. It's pretty early in the season. And this green part right here, you basically can treat like a green onion. You can just take some scissors, just cut it. You don't need to dig them up, and just treat that as a green onion. It's a little bit stronger flavor than a green onion. And then sometime in May or so, it will start to form a tough stalk on it. And that's where these bulbs will start to form up there. And that'll sit up there kind of through May, a little bit into the summer, and then these leaves will start to dry out and they'll basically just tip over. And so when they've tipped over, that's a good time if you do want to like kind of harvest these onions top setting. That's when they've kind of dried out, and naturally that's when it would actually start planting kind of again. So if you want to harvest those, that's a time to do it. And then once it's fallen over and it's kind of dried out, usually around August or so, you'll see another new growth of some green leaves. When they're young and they're new growth, you can eat those, and they're really good, just like in February. And usually they'll stay kind of green until kind of mid-November. Thanksgiving's kind of a thing to think about of when they are. And then it'll kind of almost die back and reset again. So then kind of what parts do you eat? Well, you can eat all parts. So when the greens are pretty tender, you can just treat them like a green onion. You can also be digging up the plants if you want. And so here's a nice one, like when they're really small. So like kind of those newer offshoots of the plant are also pretty tender, because it will not only be growing from these onion top sets when they fall over, it will also be spreading out and clumping from itself. And so you can dig those up. You can treat those as kind of a white onion. You can treat the bottoms as a shallot at different times of year, which is really nice. And so kind of when to be planting. So you can plant bulbs now. You can also get some divided and plant those as well. You could also be planting bulbs in August for fall. And really just, it's a really interesting plant to grow. It's very easy. So if you're ever interested in just kind of adding in some perennial crops, walking onions are a really nice one to think about. So before we jump into questions, do want to just make a plug. We did have our main garlic sale last week on last Saturday. We do have some left over. So we have hardneck garlic and we have a little bit of elephant garlic left. So we have quite a bit of hardneck, which is great. That's like my favorite. So we're out of softneck. We're out of, I think, shallots, and I think we might even be out of walking onions. So hardneck and elephant garlic. So if you're interested, this Saturday from 9 to noon, 3841 Bell Avenue, which is our demonstration garden. You can stop by, you can buy some garlic or some elephant garlic as well. So let's go through some Q&A. All right. So somebody was asking about planting garlic from the grocery store. So yes, you can. Now the thing is, you don't know what varieties they are. But they don't do, and that's a common question because people ask the same thing for like potatoes and other things like that. So like it's tougher to grow potatoes from the store just because like sometimes they put a powder on it to basically stop them from growing so that they don't grow while they're in transport. They don't do that to garlic. So you could just go buy garlic from the grocery store and plant it. There's just, I always try to push people to just like stop by a garden center at least and try to see if they have some garlic. It's much more interesting flavors you can get because the ones that the grocery store has, that garlic is chosen more not for its flavor, but for its consistency of when it's like how it survives the winter, how long it grows, and when it's harvested and how quickly it dries out. Flavor is like the 5th or 6th most important thing to them. While for varieties that we're growing ourselves, usually flavor is like one of the more important things that people are breeding for. So I would highly recommend it. But if you don't have an option, yes, you can get it from the grocery store. So, and somebody is asking, about planting garlic too early. So if you planted garlic too early, now I don't know how early is too early, but garlic is pretty resilient. So I wouldn't be too worried. And really like sometimes we've like planted in October, we have a really nice warm fall. So like it gets really big and then then we hit our fall. Other times it just stays really cold right when we plant it. We don't see much growth. Then it grows into the spring. And then in the spring, it really takes off. So if you plant it early, it might be a little bit bigger than normal. So when you are mulching through the winter, do kind of a heavier mulch, get it a lot higher than those pictures. And then expect kind of the earlier June of when you're going to be harvesting. So just kind of expect a little bit earlier. That's a really good one to think about. And then asking, what about if I plant the smallest cloves because they're difficult to peel and eat? You can do that. It's an interesting way to think about the breeding as you're basically picking the one that's the smallest of the cloves. So you're kind of almost self-selecting your garlic in the future to be smaller every time. So maybe the next year you might actually just get even a lot more smaller cloves. So it's not like it's going to be bad, but if you have trouble peeling the small garlic and you plant the smallest cloves every year, you're just going to keep getting yourself more small cloves. But interesting way to think about too. So somebody's asking about growing garlic in 5-gallon buckets. So follow that spacing with it. The one thing with any kind of 5-gallon buckets or just really like any container gardening over the winter is we're a little worried about that soil fully freezing. So if you are growing in like maybe on a deck or something like that, now garlic can handle really low temperatures. Obviously it grows the winter. We don't cover it with anything. But we don't want it to like fully freeze and thaw. So if you are doing a 5-gallon bucket, you're probably not putting many plants in, but I would put that as close to your house or building or whatever as possible, just to keep it a little bit warmer, mulch really well. And if you maybe have multiple buckets or just something like that, putting those near each other to kind of keep them a little bit warmer and use those as each other to kind of keep that space warm. So, and then asking about onions for winter harvesting. Yes, you can do that. It is a little bit more challenging, but if you already have onions in the ground, you can extend them a little bit. I would follow kind of the row cover, the plastic sheeting, or as probably row cover, probably the best for doing extending just regular onions into the winter. But they can't handle the cold temperatures that garlic and shallots do. So you will have to harvest them. Pay attention to if it starts dropping below 25, 20 degrees, I would really go out there, take a look, see if you need to pull those out. Definitely if you're just doing kind of a row cover on them, but they will sweeten up, which is really nice for kind of over winter, which is great. So. So somebody also asking about 5-gallon bucket. So if you have 5-gallon bucket, follow that spacing, but you probably are going to be doing maybe 3, 4, 5, probably, I think 3 to 5 bulbs is probably good. That's what they mention. And whenever you're doing container gardening, I think we have a whole class on container gardening up on our YouTube. So I'd recommend taking a look and just kind of looking at what mixtures, but usually a potting soil, or you want something kind of well draining. You don't want to just be pulling soil just directly from your garden because it'll be too compact. It won't let the water drain. So usually people do a mixture of like potting soil, maybe some rocks first at the bottom of a bucket with some drainage holes in it. And that's not something I mentioned earlier about the 5. If you're doing any kind of container gardening, you want to make sure that container can drain. So if it's just like a regular bucket, you will need to drill some holes in the bottom, put some rocks or something out there so that the dirt doesn't clog those holes, and then put some dirt or something on top of it. Usually you do a mixture of like potting soil or compost with just either some regular soil, just to really, you want to make sure it's nice and airy and light. And the one thing with garlic, like we were talking about earlier, it's a very heavy feeder. So you might have to be adding quite a bit of compost kind of through the growing season. And then somebody is asking about leaf mulch. So yeah, leaf mulch, it's basically it's broken down leaves. You can make them yourself, which is a really nice way. Take your leaves in your yard, rake them up. Usually we'll do, like we have some chicken wire and we'll basically just put them in a pile, kind of wrap some chicken wire around them so they're just kind of contained in the pile, and we'll let them sit over the winter. And so over the winter, they'll freeze, they'll thaw, they'll freeze, they'll thaw. So that freezing and thaw cycle will help them break down. You'll get a nice leaf mulch in the spring. You can also buy leaf mulch. I know St. Louis Composting's got it. I've seen it at Home Depot, Lowe's. So I would say you can just do kind of regular leaves, but breaking down is a lot better. So doing that over just unbroken down leaves. So, all right, I want to make sure Kai has enough time. We got a couple. Oh wow, we got a lot coming in. Oh, a good question. So recommending of plants to succeed garlic after it comes out. So a succession planting for garlic. So yeah, garlic is coming out like mid-June, maybe mid-July. So you could plant pretty much any warm season plant after it, and you'll probably get a decent harvest off of it. But the garlic pulls a lot of nutrients out of the soil. So if you do any of those, like a tomato or like zucchini or just like peppers, you're going to need to put quite a bit of compost in. What I really like to do is plant bush beans afterwards. So we're planting a legume. So we're putting in nitrogen, which is great. Bush beans are pretty quick growing. So you'll get a really good harvest pretty quickly. You could even kind of with the timing of it, you could plant the garlic, you could harvest the garlic, plant your bush beans, and then even do a late planting of a cool season plant that you might extend into the winter, or you could do something quick like some radishes after some bush beans. Also, bush beans are delicious, so they're always a good one. So that's a good recommendation. But you could plant any warm season one after, or you could even just let the ground kind of sit and then plant a cool season crop in August or so. Oh, there we go. Elaine just mentioned, and that would be a great comment in the chat, of roasting small cloves with a little olive oil wrapped in foil, 350 degrees for 45 minutes, and the cloves pop right out, and I bet they're very delicious. So, all right, I want to make sure we get a couple more questions in. So somebody was asking about, okay, I'll just jump to the straw bale because I think somebody was asking just to see the picture. So I'll jump to it while we're answering a couple other questions. So there's the picture right there. They have actually a plastic sheeting on top, which looks good. Just remember, we'll also be sending this out to everybody. So all right, best soil to grow garlic in. I mean, it's similar. So what is the best soil to grow garlic in? It's very similar to just most other plants. So well-draining soil is important. We want to make sure that we have, and so what could be limiting is just the amount of compost that are just nutrients at all that you have in your soil. Often I find a lot of people, because they're planting it after they've had, a lot of people love to grow tomatoes or just like a lot of really nutrient intensive warm season plants. And so it's really recommended right after you pull those out, if you're planting garlic, put in a decent amount of compost. And so you can get compost from a variety of places. The city of St. Louis has a bunch of free pickup sites, but if you want to order it, I know like Kirkwood Supplies got some good stuff. St. Louis Composting's got good stuff. You can also just go to Lowe's, Home Depot, but really making sure you do that and mulch it. Also that compost adding in to your garden will also help with that well-draining soil. So you get water draining through it, because the one thing is they don't want to be, just like with most plants we eat, they don't want to be in soil that holds a lot of water that sits in it. So you'll want loose, well-draining soil. All right. I want to make sure we got, do walking onions spread easily? And how do you control them or eradicate them? Yes, so they will spread, really that top setting. So they're called walking onions because they fall over. And if you just kind of let them do their thing, you would eventually see that they are spaced out every 2 feet or so, while they're also clumping and spreading bigger themselves. So if you really want to make sure you're controlling them, when they start setting that top, you can either pull those off so that you could plant them later, or you could just take some pruners and just kind of cut that whole top off and throw it in a yard waste bin or something like that. That'll really help with controlling of their spread, because they'll only be they'll basically just be continually just getting bigger around where you've planted them. They do often, like every 3 to 5 years, you might have to dig them up, separate them, and then kind of plant them if you don't want them to keep getting bigger. And somebody's asking about harvesting the green shoots from their walking onions, and if harvesting too hard in August will harm their ability to overwinter. I would not be too worried about it. I have never seen, we've done some pretty aggressive harvesting off of them. We've treated them pretty hard, and they overwinter very well. So I would not be too worried about it. If for some reason it doesn't, I would be very surprised, but then you can come get some of ours because we have lots. So I can recommend doing that, but I think you're fine. All right, so we're a little past 7. I know there's other questions in here. If you do, I'm sorry, I can't get to all of them, but if you do want to, let me put to my slide at the end. If you want to just shoot us an email, or you can follow us on social media and ask. We'll be sending out the presentation slides probably tomorrow morning. And actually, let me stop the recording now.